Thailand is famous for tourism, some of the world's spiciest foods, and also for something you probably use every day but didn't know that it was made there. Yes, we're talking about an essential part of your computer, something so important that it makes Thailand a global news story when things like this happen.
Thailand's devastating floods are hitting PC hard drive supplies, warn analysts. The Guardian, 2011.
This news might be from 2011, but trust us, things haven't changed much. Thailand is still a huge production hub for electronics and currently produces 40% of the world's hard drives. And that's surprising because despite Thailand's growing economy and great industrial capabilities, it's shockingly unstable. Since the 1930s, Thailand averages a coup every 4 years. It's a far cry from democracy. Human rights are often disrespected, there's no freedom of speech, and insulting the monarchy can land you in prison. Despite all of this, Thai people enjoy an income similar to that of the Chinese. They have a surprisingly egalitarian society with virtually no unemployment and no inflation. Obviously, they are not as rich as the Swiss, but they do much better than their neighbors in Vietnam, for example. And no, in case you were wondering, Thailand is not oil-rich or even gold-rich. Nope, this is not a country that got rich on natural resources at all. That's why today's question is, how can such a tumultuous and repressive country be doing so well economically? How did they become such an important industrial center? Well, we're going to answer these questions, but before we do, let's take a look back at the history.
In the country of the blind.
Thai monarchy is very easy to study because basically you just have to remember one name and then keep counting. The current king is King Rama X, but before that there was King Rama IX. His father was, you guessed it, Rama VIII, and this goes all the way back to the first Rama. And I know what you're probably thinking, 10 generations, Simon? Didn't you just say that Thailand was unstable? How can that be if they've had the same family ruling for the last 237 years? Well, I think that Eric is going to give us a bit more information about that.
So the reality is that since 1932, Thailand had 12 successful and 7 failed attempted coups. But most of these were coups from different factions of the army fighting with one another and always respecting the place of the monarch. So yes, they changed the government, but not the king, never the king. And the government always keeps this classical Thai flavor of military authoritarianism.
However, a little brutal authoritarianism has never stopped the bastions of democracy from cozying up to a country. You see, Thailand's growth and development in Southeast Asia has been brought about thanks to Western investment. Just think about the United States in the 1970s. They needed a partner in the region, and now take a look at this map from the era. Here we have Cambodia, which was essentially a communist hellscape. Vietnam was also communist and at war. Laos is landlocked and, again, communist. Indonesia was unstable and problematic, and then there was Burma, which remained one of the world's most isolated countries until very recently. Basically, there was only one country the US could partner with, and that was Thailand. It helps a lot that the kings of Thailand and their military leaders have always been fervently anti-communist, and so Thailand became a great natural ally for the United States and Japan during the Cold War. But we're not only talking about politics. When it comes to economics, Thailand has a shocking advantage that most people are unaware of. Their currency is surprisingly stable. Yes, the baht, the Thai currency, is one of the world's most stable currencies. It was pegged to the dollar up until the 1970s. And this is a great advantage for investors because no matter what happens, the money you put there will always hold its value. This is much better than what many other countries can offer. And then there is the tourism. By 1967, Thailand already received over 330,000 tourists a year, mostly from countries like Japan, Australia, and the United States. In other words, they could get away with a dodgy political system because all of its neighbors were more than happy to spend their money and time there. And this explains the enormous investments that the United States made in this country. For example, they built an entire highway measuring 510 kilometers that became the first step for the Thai government to start building infrastructure of its own. Thanks to this, the country now has some of the best infrastructure networks in the region. But make no mistake, Thailand's best friend was not America, it was Japan. Back then, Japan was starting to develop their own international agenda. This is when the flying geese paradigm came up. Basically, Japan wanted to increase its economic clout in the region. So the Japanese government began investing alongside the private sector in Southeast Asian countries. And again, in that time, Thailand was the best place in which to put your money. In a way, Thailand was to Japan what Mexico was to the United States. I know what you might be thinking right now, well, this is another story of a poor country rolling out the red carpet for international capitalism, right? Well, actually not really. In fact, the opposite is true. At that time, Thailand was incredibly protectionist. During the 1970s, some goods such as alcohol, shoes, and cars had tariffs of up to 90%, and price controls became commonplace on regular goods. Thailand, it was just a cheap labor hub. But then, in the 1980s, something happened. Something that had a deep impact on this country.
In a world of high technology and ever-changing modes, in a world that's full of make-believe and changing attitudes, are you keeping up with the Commodore?
A hard-driven economy.
The first personal computers were launched in the 1970s, but the real IT boom started in the 1980s. All of a sudden, every office worker had his or her own personal computer. People also bought one to have at home.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
And which countries led this technological revolution? Well, of course, it was the United States and Japan. Companies like the US's Atari or Japanese Sharp dominated the PC market in the early days. But they were not the only ones. Soon Apple would start creating their own models too, and the race it was on to come up with better and cheaper models. They had to cut costs by any means, and there was one component that didn't require the highly skilled labor that you need for making microchips, and that component was the hard drive. So which country would be the best candidate to develop hard drive manufacturing facilities? Well, that would be a country that had close ties to one of the main PC producers, a country that already had good industry and good infrastructure. And yes, obviously, that country was Thailand. This explains why Seagate Technology, one of the leading hard drive firms, opens their first factory in Thailand back in 1973. But this was not the only company to set up shop there. During the 1980s, after a couple more coups d'etats, Thailand slashed most of their tariffs. They opened up part of their international trade. And this incentivized many other companies to follow Seagate's lead. Do you remember the network effect? We've talked about it a few times here on VisualPolitik. Once you have a critical mass of companies from a certain industry, you create a network of suppliers, universities, and specialization. For example, by 1992, Hitachi started operating in Thailand and now has 40 subsidiaries and 16,000 employees in the country. This means that they can buy all of the supplies they need for making hard drives in Thailand in bulk, saving the company millions of dollars. Seagate currently has over 11,000 workers in the country, producing 50 million hard drives a year, and half of Toshiba's hard disk drives come from Thailand. Thailand is responsible for a whopping 40% of the global hard disk drive production. That's worth about $12 billion a year. And you might now be wondering, well, is this a lot of money? Well, it works out to about 2.6% of Thailand's GDP. Yep, 2.6% of Thailand's GDP comes from only producing hard disk drives. Now, no one can say for certain where the trend is heading, but it certainly doesn't seem to be slowing down.
Seagate to invest $470 million in Thailand over the next 5 years. Reuters, 2015.
But this isn't the only good news for Thailand. With an already established network of technological companies, it's easy to attract other industries to set up in the country. In the 1960s, Thailand already had contracts with some automobile firms. Now they are the biggest car producer in all of Southeast Asia.
Mitsubishi ships its 4 millionth vehicle from Thailand. Bangkok Post, 2019.
In 2014, Japanese companies employed 700,000 Thai workers. That's about 1% of the population. In 2012, Japanese corporations invested $11 billion in Thailand. But hold on a minute, because it's not all sunshine and smog-tinged rainbows in Thailand. So here's the thing. Lots of products, probably products you use every day, are made in Thailand, right? But can you name any of the Thai companies? No? Well, we can't really blame you. Everything you own that says Made in Thailand on it probably also has the brand of a Japanese, South Korean, or US company. And a lack of international megacorps isn't Thailand's only issue. Let's take a closer look.
A nation at the crossroads.
Remember all those coups I mentioned earlier? Well, they're not just a thing of the past. In fact, their most recent coup d'etat, one of the successful ones, happened as recently as May of 2014. When the junta took over, they wielded the usual authoritarian fist. In this case, it led to a new constitution being adopted in 2017. This came after a referendum that had received a 59% yes vote. So it might sound like the people got what they wanted, but, well, not really. The military had intimidated, threatened, and arrested critics of the referendum and constitution, along with political activists that advocated voting it down or abstaining from voting altogether. Even legal opposition parties were formally forbidden from campaigning against it. The new constitution is generally considered something that was forced through by the military to increase their influence and power for decades to come. And the same goes with elections. In March of 2019, actual elections were held in Thailand. The issue? Well, all 250 senators who helped decide the prime minister were appointed by the military under military rule. As you can imagine, the outcome was as surprising as the ending of a romantic comedy. They elected General Prayut Chan-o-cha, the man who launched the coup and had run the country under the recent junta. Basically, the military junta managed to manipulate elections to get itself elected in order to maintain control. Now, there is a silver lining, though. There were still civilian parliamentary elections in which a large legal and lively pro-democracy opposition from a variety of parties were voted in, the most liberal of them being the Young Future Forward Party, which got almost 18% of the vote. But unfortunately, this has yet to alleviate authoritarianism in the short term and in the everyday running of the country. Blasphemy laws are still enforced, and an insult on Facebook recently got a man sentenced to 35 years in prison. Now, normally, tumultuous coups and this sort of arbitrary authoritarianism would scare away investors, and the Thai government, they're well aware of this. However, the Thai people are lucky in at least two regards. External factors are keeping the Thai economy afloat, and their government knows how to capitalize on it.
Thailand dangles 50% tax cut for manufacturers fleeing China.
Exactly. The trade war between China and the United States has a lot of losers, but also some winners, and Thailand could be one of them. As companies flee US tariffs on China, they look to set up shop in other countries with similarly cheaper labor. Thailand is one of those places. These conditions, mixed with a lot of experience attracting international business with things like tax cuts, mean that Thailand will, at the very least, maintain its foreign investment.
On the plus side, there's another booming industry in this country: tourism. So, how many tourists came to Thailand in 1967? It was 330,000. Now, today, it's over 30 million tourists every year. If you thought that Thailand was overly reliant on hard disk drives at 2.6% of GDP, well, keep in mind that tourism makes up about 17% of GDP, and it doesn't look like it's going down anytime soon either.
However, Thailand is still just a bit player. On a global scale, Thailand's essentially an industrial park and a tourist playground for more influential Western and Oriental countries, one that's subject to the occasional storm of power struggles. Thailand is still stuck in a cycle of coups that keep Thailand from experiencing being one of the miracles like Singapore or Japan. Thailand lacks its own entrepreneurs and international corporations that would keep all of the profits in the country. And this is the price that you pay for having such an authoritarian and, more to the point, arbitrary system. If you want to have your own entrepreneurs, you need a higher degree of freedom and stability. Well, now it's over to you. Do you think Thailand will climb out of the middle-income trap and become a South Korea in the jungle? Will the Future Forward Party succeed in cementing a democracy in the country? Or will things just remain the same? Well, we'd love to hear your comments below. Also, please do visit our friends from reconsidermedia.com. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, we publish brand new videos every week, so please do subscribe, hit that bell button, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.